The fluorescent lights hummed above the Pentagon briefing room like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across Major Sarah Chen's uniform as she stood at attention before the inquiry panel. Her shoulders were rigid, perfectly squared, but beneath the starched fabric of her dress blues, old wounds pulled tight against scar tissue that had never quite learned to bend the way it should. The American flag hung motionless in the corner, its colors somehow muted under the artificial light, while 5 officers sat behind a mahogany table that gleamed with the polish of bureaucracy. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Major Chen, General Patricia Hawthorne's voice cut through the sterile air, her silver hair catching the light as she leaned forward. You've been accused of insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and compromising a classified operation in Afghanistan. These are serious charges that could end your career. The general's fingers drummed once against the table's surface, a sound that echoed like distant gunfire in the silence that followed. Sarah's breath caught for just a moment, not from fear but from the way the overhead lights suddenly reminded her of the medical bay in Kandahar, where she'd first seen her back in a mirror after the surgery. The entry wounds had healed into perfect circles, like coins pressed into her flesh, each one a reminder of the moment she'd chosen to shield her unit instead of following orders to retreat. The exit wounds were different. Jagged, angry things that told the story of bullets that had tumbled and torn their way through her body, carrying pieces of her old life with them as they went. I understand the charges, ma'am, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammered against her throat. The words felt foreign in her mouth, practiced but hollow, like reciting a prayer she'd long stopped believing in. To her left sat Captain Marcus Rivera, the intelligence officer who'd tried to warn her about the ambush 3 months ago, his dark eyes fixed on his hands rather than meeting her gaze. His wedding ring caught the light as he shifted nervously, and Sarah could almost hear the conversation he'd had with his wife the night before, the same conversation every military spouse had when duty and conscience collided. Marcus had 2 daughters, 7 and 9, who drew pictures of him in uniform and hung them on their refrigerator with alphabet magnets. Sarah knew this because he'd shown her the photos during their last mission briefing, back when they were still allowed to be friends. On her right, Colonel James Mitchell cleared his throat softly, the sound carrying the weight of 30 years in uniform. His chest bore rows of ribbons that told the story of a career spent in places most people couldn't find on a map, but his eyes held something different now, a wariness that hadn't been there before the incident. Mitchell had been Sarah's mentor since she'd arrived at the Pentagon, the one who'd recommended her for the Afghanistan assignment, who'd believed in her potential to lead. The coffee cup in his hands bore the emblem of his old unit, the 82nd Airborne, and Sarah noticed how his fingers traced the edges of the logo when he was thinking, a habit she'd observed during countless briefings. The briefing room itself seemed to pulse with invisible tension, its beige walls lined with photographs of distinguished officers who'd sat in similar chairs decades before. Some of those faces stared down with expressions of pride, others with the hollow look of men who'd seen too much and said too little. The air recycling system whispered overhead, a constant mechanical breath that never quite managed to clear the atmosphere of accumulated decisions, compromises, and careful omissions. General Hawthorne opened the manila folder before her, the sound of paper against paper sharp in the quiet room. Inside were photographs Sarah had hoped never to see again, satellite images of the village where it had all gone wrong, medical reports with clinical descriptions of her injuries, and testimonies from soldiers whose names had been blacked out with government-issue markers. The general's reading glasses reflected the ceiling lights as she studied the documents, her expression unreadable behind decades of practiced neutrality. Major Chen, the general continued, according to these reports, you were ordered to maintain position at Checkpoint Delta, while air support eliminated suspected Taliban positions in the village below. Instead, you led your unit into the village to evacuate civilians, directly disobeying explicit instructions from command. Your actions resulted in your own severe injuries and put your entire unit at risk. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, each one carefully chosen and precisely delivered, but they didn't capture the sound of children crying in the pre-dawn darkness, or the way the morning call to prayer had been interrupted by the whistle of incoming mortars. They didn't describe how Sergeant Tommy Walsh had looked at her when she'd given the order to move, his young face torn between training and instinct, or how Private Elena Vasquez had grabbed her arm and whispered, "Ma'am, are you sure?" in a voice that carried the weight of every war story she'd ever heard. Sarah's mind drifted back to that morning in Kandahar province, the way the desert sun had painted the mountains gold and crimson as it rose over a landscape that had seen too many wars. The village had been little more than a collection of mud brick houses clustered around a well, home to maybe 300 people who'd never asked to be caught between empires. The intelligence reports had identified it as a Taliban stronghold, but Sarah had seen the goats wandering between the buildings, heard the sound of a grandmother singing to her grandchildren, watched smoke rise from cooking fires where women prepared breakfast for their families. The intel was wrong, Sarah said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. There were civilians down there, families. Colonel Mitchell's pen stopped moving across his notepad, and Captain Rivera finally looked up from his hands. General Hawthorne's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. "Major Chen," the general said softly, "intelligence assessments are not your responsibility. Following orders is." But Sarah was no longer entirely in the briefing room. Part of her was back in the village, crouched behind a crumbling wall with her rifle trained on empty air while her unit spread out through the narrow streets. She could smell the dust and cordite, feel the way her body armor had grown heavier with each passing minute, remember the exact moment when she'd realized the morning prayers weren't coming from a mosque but from an old man kneeling in his courtyard, his weathered hands pressed to the earth in supplication. The inquiry panel waited for her response, but Sarah found herself thinking about the medal case in her apartment back in Arlington, where her Purple Heart lay nestled in blue velvet beside her Bronze Star and Combat Action Badge. Those pieces of metal and ribbon were supposed to tell the story of her service, but they couldn't speak to the weight of decisions made in seconds that would echo for lifetimes. They couldn't explain why she still woke up some nights with the taste of desert sand in her mouth and the sound of helicopter rotors in her ears. "Ma'am," Sarah began again, her voice steadier now, "I'd like to request permission to explain my actions in full. There are details in my report that may not have been given proper consideration." General Hawthorne closed the folder with a soft thud that seemed to reverberate through the room. Outside, the Washington traffic hummed with the rhythm of a city that never quite stopped moving, where decisions made in rooms like this one rippled outward through headlines and history books. The American flag in the corner stirred slightly in the artificial breeze from the ventilation system, its fabric whispering secrets that only those who'd served under it could fully understand. "Major Chen," the general said, removing her reading glasses and setting them carefully on the polished table, "you'll have your chance to speak. But I want you to understand something first. This inquiry isn't just about what happened in that village. It's about trust, chain of command, and the principles that hold our military together. Your actions, however well-intentioned, have consequences that extend far beyond your own career." The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, charged with possibility and weighted with the knowledge that some conversations change everything. Sarah's dress blues felt suddenly tight across her shoulders, the fabric pulling against skin that had been remade by surgeons in time, that bore the permanent evidence of a choice she would make again without hesitation. As she prepared to tell her story, Sarah Chen wondered if the officers sitting before her would understand that some wounds never fully heal, not because they can't, but because they're meant to remain as reminders. The entry wounds on her back had closed into small, neat scars, but they still ached when storms were coming, still pulled tight when she moved too quickly, still served as a compass pointing always toward a morning in Afghanistan when she'd learned the difference between following orders and doing what was right. The fluorescent lights continued their electric hum, casting the same harsh shadows, but something in the room had shifted. Perhaps it was the way Captain Rivera finally met her eyes, or the slight nod Colonel Mitchell gave her, or the way General Hawthorne leaned back in her chair as if settling in for a long story. Whatever it was, Sarah felt the first stirring of hope that her truth might finally find its way into the light. But first, she would have to find the courage to show them what those entry wounds had really cost, and what they had ultimately been worth. Sarah Chen had never intended to be a soldier. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, she'd dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, spending summers volunteering at animal shelters and winters, saving money from her part-time job at a local bookstore. Her bedroom walls had been covered with photographs of rescued dogs and cats, not military heroes, and her bookshelf overflowed with stories about people who healed rather than harmed. But September 11th had changed the trajectory of her life, as it had for so many of her generation, turning 18-year-old dreams into dust and reshaping them into something harder, more purposeful. Her parents, both immigrants from Taiwan who'd built a modest life running a small electronics repair shop, had watched their daughter transform from a gentle teenager who cried over injured birds into a determined young woman studying maps of countries they'd never heard of. David Chen would sit at his workbench in the evenings, his reading glasses reflecting the glow of circuit boards and microchips, while his wife Lisa prepared traditional dishes that filled their small house with the sense of home. They'd never spoken directly about their fears, but Sarah had seen the way her mother's hands trembled when folding her laundry, had noticed how her father always turned the television volume down when the news mentioned casualties overseas. The morning routine in Sarah's Arlington apartment had become a meditation of sorts, a careful choreography designed to prepare her body and mind for whatever the day might bring. She woke each day at 0530 hours. Not because regulations demanded it, but because sleep beyond that point brought dreams she preferred to avoid. The first sensation was always the pull of scar tissue across her back as she sat up in bed, followed by the brief moment of disorientation that came with returning to a world where bullets weren't flying and the air didn't smell like burning diesel and fear. Her bathroom mirror reflected a woman who looked older than her 32 years, though not in the way most people aged. Sarah's face had gained a quality of stillness that came from learning to control expressions under stress, to reveal nothing while processing everything. Her dark hair, once long enough to braid, now barely brushed her shoulders, a practical choice made after too many missions where loose hair could mean the difference between concealment and discovery. But it was her eyes that told the real story, dark brown depths that held flecks of gold when she laughed, which happened less often now than it used to. The physical therapy exercises came next, a routine prescribed by Dr. Patricia Morrison at Walter Reed Medical Center. 20 minutes of careful stretching and strengthening designed to maintain mobility in muscles and joints that had been reorganized by shrapnel and surgical steel. Sarah performed each movement with the same precision she brought to everything else, counting repetitions while her mind wandered to places her body couldn't go anymore. The exercises hurt, but the pain was familiar now, a constant companion that reminded her she was still breathing, still fighting, still here. Breakfast was usually the same: oatmeal with fresh berries, black coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and 30 minutes of reading that had nothing to do with military strategy or operational planning. Sarah had discovered poetry during her recovery, drawn to verses that captured truths too complex for official reports. Mary Oliver's words about paying attention, about the soft animal of the body, had become a kind of prayer she recited while watching sunrise paint her kitchen walls gold and amber. These moments of beauty felt stolen somehow, borrowed time from a world that seemed increasingly designed around conflict rather than wonder. The drive to the Pentagon each morning took her past the same landmarks, a journey that had become its own form of meditation. Arlington Cemetery spread across rolling hills to her left, row upon row of white headstones, marking the final position of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who'd served their country unto death. Sarah knew some of those names, had served with men and women who now lay beneath that meticulously maintained grass, and she always drove a little slower past the entrance gates, as if speed might somehow diminish the respect owed to the fallen. Her office on the 3rd floor of the Pentagon was spartanly decorated, containing only the essential tools of her trade, and a few personal items that kept her tethered to the civilian world she'd left behind. A photograph of her parents stood on her desk, taken during her graduation from the Air Force Academy. Her father's proud smile broad enough to power small cities, her mother's hand resting protectively on Sarah's shoulder as if she could somehow shield her daughter from whatever was coming. Next to it sat a small jade plant her sister had given her, a hardy succulent that thrived despite irregular watering and the building's artificial environment. The work itself had become a kind of puzzle she couldn't quite solve, intelligence analysis that required her to sift through reports from around the world, looking for patterns that might prevent the next disaster. She read transcripts of intercepted communications, studied satellite photographs of remote valleys and urban neighborhoods, tracked the movements of people whose motivations she could only guess at. It was important work, she knew, but it felt somehow removed from the immediate reality of soldiers on the ground, the weight of a loaded rifle, the split-second decisions that determined who lived and who didn't. Lunch breaks were often spent walking the Pentagon's corridors, a habit she'd developed during her first week back from medical leave. The building's geometry had a hypnotic quality, its 5 sides and concentric rings creating a maze that somehow always led back to where she'd started. She'd learned to navigate by instinct rather than signs, her feet carrying her past offices where other officers made their own difficult decisions, past conference rooms where strategies were debated and revised, past memorial walls that honored those who'd given everything in service to their country. The afternoon hours brought different challenges, briefings where she presented her analysis to senior officers who would use her words to make decisions she might never see the consequences of. Sarah had learned to speak with confidence about probabilities and threat assessments, to reduce complex human situations into bullet points and risk matrices that fit neatly into PowerPoint presentations. But part of her always wondered about the faces behind the intelligence reports, the children who might be walking to school in villages she'd identified as potential targets, the mothers who might be hanging laundry on lines strung between buildings that appeared as geometric shapes in satellite imagery. Evening brought its own rituals, beginning with the drive home through Washington traffic that moved with the sluggish persistence of bureaucracy itself. Sarah's apartment welcomed her with familiar silence, a space she'd carefully curated to promote healing and reflection. The living room contained a comfortable chair positioned to catch the last rays of sunlight through west-facing windows, a bookshelf filled with volumes that had nothing to do with war or strategy, and a small stereo system that filled quiet evenings with jazz music her father had introduced her to years ago. Dinner was usually simple, often something she could prepare while her mind processed the day's events. Sarah had discovered that cooking required a kind of attention that quieted the analytical part of her brain, the constant assessment and evaluation that had become second nature. Chopping vegetables, timing pasta, seasoning soup. These tasks demanded presence rather than planning, sensation rather than strategy. The kitchen became a sanctuary where she could exist without rank or responsibility, where the only orders that mattered were the ones that helped create something nourishing and good. The phone calls to her parents came twice a week, usually on Tuesday and Friday evenings when she knew they'd be closing the repair shop and preparing dinner. These conversations had developed their own careful choreography over the years, topics approached and retreated from like dancers learning complicated steps. Her father would share news about customers whose devices he'd resurrected, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose work produced tangible results. Her mother would talk about the garden she'd planted behind the shop, describing tomatoes and herbs with the same love she'd once used to speak about her daughter's achievements. Neither parent asked directly about her work or her injuries, but Sarah could hear the questions hiding behind their careful words, the love and worry they carried for a daughter whose life had become something they couldn't fully understand. She tried to reassure them with details about apartment hunting, weekend plans, books she was reading, anything that suggested normalcy and safety, and a future that extended beyond the next deployment or assignment. Sleep, when it finally came, was often restless and populated with dreams that blurred the boundaries between memory and imagination. Sarah would find herself back in Afghanistan, not always in the village where she'd been wounded, but in other places. Other moments when choices had determined outcomes in ways that couldn't be undone. She'd wake sometimes with the taste of dust in her mouth and the echo of helicopter rotors in her ears, her body rigid with alertness until her conscious mind could convince her sleeping self that she was safe, that the war was thousands of miles away, that the only battles she needed to fight today were the ones being waged in briefing rooms and committee hearings. But even in sleep, the entry wounds on her back would sometimes ache with changes in weather or atmospheric pressure, as if her body had become a barometer calibrated to detect incoming storms. The scars had faded from angry red to pale silver, but they remained sensitive to temperature and touch, a permanent reminder of the morning when she'd learned that some prices are worth paying, even when the cost is measured in flesh and bone, and the comfortable certainty that following orders always leads to the right outcome. The first crack in Sarah's carefully constructed routine appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, when Captain Rivera slid a manila folder across her desk with hands that shook just enough to rattle the coffee cup he was holding. The folder's contents would have been unremarkable to most people. Satellite imagery, communication intercepts, routine intelligence assessments from various field stations across Afghanistan and Iraq. But Sarah's trained eye immediately caught the discrepancies. The subtle alterations in targeting data that suggested someone was systematically editing reports before they reached decision-makers. "Jesus, Marcus," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the Pentagon's ever-present hum of ventilation systems and distant conversations. "How long has this been going on?" Rivera's wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as he ran his hand through his dark hair, a gesture Sarah recognized as his tell when dealing with information that kept him awake at night. "At least 6 months, maybe longer. The pattern started showing up in cross-referenced reports last week, but when I tried to trace it back..." He trailed off, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in and demand explanations for questions that shouldn't be asked. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow, the same sensation she'd felt in the village when the first bullet had torn through her tactical vest and into her back. Someone was deliberately altering intelligence reports, which meant operations were being planned and executed based on false information. Worse, the alterations appeared designed to minimize civilian casualty estimates and inflate threat assessments, creating a perfect storm of conditions that made tragedies like the one she'd witnessed not just possible, but inevitable. Hatch. By Thursday of that same week, Sarah had identified at least 12 instances where intelligence had been manipulated before reaching operational planners. Each case followed the same pattern: original reports that included detailed civilian population data and nuanced threat assessments were edited to remove references to non-combatants while emphasizing suspected enemy activity. The editing was sophisticated, professional, the kind of work that required both high-level access and detailed knowledge of how intelligence products were consumed by commanding officers in the field. The confrontation with Colonel Harrison came during a routine briefing on Friday afternoon, when Sarah presented her analysis of recent operations in Helmand Province. Colonel Richard Harrison was a career officer who'd risen through the ranks by delivering clear, actionable intelligence that supported decisive military action. His office walls were decorated with commendations from grateful field commanders, and his reputation for accuracy had made him one of the most trusted voices in Pentagon intelligence circles. He was also, Sarah had discovered, signing off on every altered report she'd identified. "Major Chen," Harrison said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "your analysis seems to suggest there are fundamental flaws in our intelligence processes. That's a serious allegation that requires serious evidence." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, the same physiological response she'd experienced moments before making the decision to disobey orders in Afghanistan. Her back ached where old wounds pulled against scar tissue, as if her body was remembering the cost of speaking truth to power. "Sir, the evidence is in the reports themselves. Original assessments consistently mentioned civilian populations and infrastructure, but those references are removed before the intelligence reaches operational units. The result, Harrison interrupted, is clean, actionable intelligence that allows our commanders to make effective decisions without being paralyzed by secondary considerations. Major, your job is to provide analysis, not to question the wisdom of those above you in the chain of command." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished fire, carrying the acrid smell of compromise and willful blindness. Sarah realized she was standing at another crossroads, another moment when following orders and doing what was right led in opposite directions. The safety of her career, her future, her carefully rebuilt life all depended on accepting Harrison's explanation and filing her concerns away in the same mental compartment where she stored other uncomfortable truths. Instead, she opened her laptop and turned the screen toward Harrison, displaying a side-by-side comparison of original and edited intelligence reports from the village where she'd been wounded. "Sir, this is the intelligence assessment that led to the operation where I was injured. The original report identified a population of approximately 300 civilians, including 67 children under the age of 12. The version that reached the operational commander made no mention of civilian presence and recommended immediate airstrikes on all identified structures." Harrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested she'd crossed a line from which there might be no return. Outside his office window, Washington traffic moved with its usual purposeful chaos, a river of people going about their lives without knowing that decisions made in rooms like this one might determine which villages appeared on tomorrow's casualty reports. "Major Chen," Harrison said finally, "I'm going to give you some advice that might save your career. Some truths are too big for individual officers to carry. Your job is to provide technical analysis within your area of expertise. not to make policy decisions about how that analysis is presented to operational commanders. Do I make myself clear? The clarity was absolute, but not in the way Harrison intended. Sarah understood that she was being offered a choice between complicity and consequence, between career advancement and the weight of knowing that her silence might cost lives she would never meet in villages she would never see. The entry wounds on her back seemed to pulse with remembered pain, as if her body was reminding her that some prices were worth paying, even when the cost was measured in everything you'd worked to build. That weekend, Sarah drove to Arlington Cemetery and walked among the white headstones until she found the grave of Sergeant Tommy Walsh, the young soldier who'd been part of her unit in Afghanistan. Tommy had been 23 when he died, 6 months after the operation where Sarah had been wounded, killed by an improvised explosive device while trying to evacuate civilians from another village that intelligence had identified as a terrorist stronghold. The circumstances of his death had been hauntingly familiar. Bad intelligence, civilian casualties, a young soldier trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. Standing before Tommy's grave, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would document every instance of altered intelligence she could find, build a case so comprehensive that it couldn't be ignored or dismissed, and present it to someone with both the authority and the integrity to act on it. The process would probably end her military career, might result in criminal charges, would certainly destroy the life she'd carefully constructed in the years since her recovery. But the alternative, remaining silent while soldiers like Tommy died in operations based on deliberately falsified information, was unthinkable. Monday morning brought a new urgency to Sarah's routine. She arrived at the Pentagon earlier, stayed later, and spent every spare moment cross-referencing reports and communications, building a database of alterations that stretched back nearly 2 years. The pattern was more extensive than she'd initially suspected, involving not just Colonel Harrison, but a network of intelligence officers who were systematically sanitizing reports to support predetermined operational objectives. The investigation led her into areas of military bureaucracy she'd never explored, classified systems and restricted databases that required special clearances and careful navigation. Sarah used her access carefully, always staying within the bounds of her official duties while gradually assembling a picture that was both horrifying and undeniable. The falsified intelligence hadn't just contributed to civilian casualties, it had also led to military disasters, failed operations, and the deaths of American service members who'd been sent into situations they weren't properly prepared for. Captain Rivera became her unofficial partner in the investigation, though he approached it with the careful paranoia of someone who understood the career implications of what they were uncovering. During coffee breaks and lunch meetings, they would discuss their findings in coded language, sharing information that couldn't be communicated through official channels. Rivera's expertise in signals intelligence proved invaluable for tracking the digital fingerprints of altered documents, while Sarah's analytical skills helped identify the broader patterns that connected individual incidents into a comprehensive conspiracy. The emotional toll of the investigation began to show in Sarah's daily routine. Her morning exercises became more aggressive, as if she could somehow burn away the frustration and anger that came with each new discovery. Her evening poetry readings gave way to long walks through Arlington neighborhoods, nocturnal wanderings that helped her process the implications of what she was learning. Sleep became even more elusive, interrupted by dreams that mixed memories of Afghanistan with images of villages she'd never seen, populated by children whose faces she'd only glimpsed in surveillance photographs. The first direct threat came in the form of a personnel evaluation that questioned Sarah's psychological fitness for her current assignment. The evaluation, signed by Colonel Harrison and 2 other officers she'd never met, cited concerns about her excessive focus on peripheral details and her apparent difficulty accepting standard operational procedures. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic assassination, carefully worded to raise doubts about her judgment while providing plausible cover for any actions that might follow. Sarah recognized the evaluation for what it was, a warning shot across her bow, a signal that her investigation had been noticed and that consequences were being prepared. But rather than deterring her, the threat only strengthened her resolve. She began making copies of everything, storing backup files in multiple locations, and preparing a comprehensive report that would be impossible to suppress or discredit. If they were going to destroy her career, she would make sure the truth survived the demolition. The confrontation with General Morrison happened during a routine intelligence briefing on a Thursday afternoon in late April. General Patricia Morrison was Harrison's direct superior, a career officer with a reputation for thoroughness and integrity who'd risen through the ranks during some of the military's most challenging operations. Sarah had requested the meeting through official channels, describing it only as a matter requiring urgent attention from senior leadership. Morrison's office reflected her personality, meticulously organized, efficiently decorated, containing only the essential elements needed to conduct serious business. The American flag stood at attention in one corner, while her desk bore photographs of units she'd commanded and operations she'd overseen. Her expression was professionally neutral as Sarah began her presentation, but it shifted subtly as the scope and implications of the intelligence manipulation became clear. "Major Chen," Morrison said when Sarah finished her briefing, "these are extraordinary allegations that, if proven true, would represent a fundamental breach of military ethics and potentially criminal activity. Are you prepared to stake your career on the accuracy of these claims?" Sarah felt the familiar ache in her back where bullets had once torn through muscle and bone, a physical reminder of the last time she'd been forced to choose between following orders and doing what she believed was right. The entry wounds had healed into small, neat scars, but they still served as a compass pointing toward moral north, toward the understanding that some truths demanded to be told regardless of the personal cost. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I am." General Morrison's investigation moved with the swift, methodical precision of a military operation, but Sarah quickly discovered that exposing the truth was more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Within 48 hours of her meeting with Morrison, Sarah found herself transferred to a temporary assignment reviewing historical intelligence files, a bureaucratic exile that effectively removed her from any current operations while keeping her isolated from the ongoing investigation. The message was clear. She had lit a fuse that would either illuminate the darkness or consume everything in its path. The investigation began quietly, with Morrison assembling a small team of trusted officers to review Sarah's evidence. Colonel Janet Williams, a career intelligence officer with 30 years of unblemished service, was assigned to lead the review. Williams had earned her reputation during the Gulf War, where her analysis had prevented several friendly fire incidents and saved countless lives. Her methodical approach to evidence evaluation had made her the military's go-to investigator for complex cases involving potential misconduct. Captain Rivera found himself caught between loyalty to Sarah and fear for his own future. During a tense conversation in the Pentagon parking garage, he confided his concerns about the investigation's potential to destroy everyone it touched. "Sarah, they're not just going to let this slide," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold March air. "Harrison has connections all the way to the Joint Chiefs. If this goes wrong, we're all finished." But Sarah's resolve had crystallized into something harder than steel. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see Tommy Walsh's face. Remember the weight of his body when she'd helped carry him to the medevac helicopter. Feel the sticky warmth of his blood on her hands as she tried to stop the bleeding from wounds that were too severe for battlefield medicine to heal. The knowledge that his death might have been prevented by accurate intelligence gave her a strength that transcended personal consequences. The first breakthrough came when Colonel Williams discovered that the intelligence alterations weren't random acts of editorial license, but part of a systematic campaign to support a specific strategic objective. Someone with significant authority had decided that civilian casualty estimates were hampering military effectiveness, and had implemented a policy of sanitizing intelligence reports to eliminate information that might constrain operational planning. The policy wasn't official, wasn't documented in any regulation or directive, but its fingerprints were visible across months of modified reports. Williams's investigation revealed that the alterations originated from a small group of senior intelligence officers who believed they were serving the greater good by removing what they saw as unnecessary complications from the decision-making process. Colonel Harrison was just one node in a network that extended throughout the Pentagon's intelligence apparatus, involving officers who had convinced themselves that protecting commanders from difficult moral choices was a form of patriotic service. The confrontation that would change everything happened during a closed-door session between Williams and Harrison in early May. Harrison, believing he was meeting with a sympathetic colleague who understood the practical necessities of military intelligence, made the mistake of speaking freely about the rationale behind the altered reports. Unknown to him, Williams was recording the conversation with Morrison's authorization, capturing his admission that intelligence products were routinely edited to remove distractions that might prevent decisive action. "The problem with raw intelligence," Harrison explained to Williams, "is that it's messy, full of maybes and possibilities that paralyze decision-makers. Our job isn't just to report what we see, but to provide analysis that enables action. If that means emphasizing military threats while de-emphasizing civilian concerns, that's a judgment call we're qualified to make. Williams pressed him for details, and Harrison obligingly described the systematic process by which intelligence reports were sanitized before reaching operational commanders. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed his actions were not just justified but necessary, explaining how civilian casualty estimates were reduced or eliminated entirely, how threat assessments were enhanced to support predetermined operational objectives, how inconvenient truths were edited into manageable fiction. The recording of Harrison's admission became the cornerstone of a case that would eventually reach the highest levels of military leadership. But the investigation scope continued to expand as Williams uncovered additional evidence of systematic intelligence manipulation spanning multiple theaters of operation. What had begun as Sarah's discovery of altered reports from Afghanistan had metastasized into a comprehensive examination of how intelligence was processed, packaged, and presented throughout the entire military command structure. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself under increasingly intense scrutiny from officers who saw her as a troublemaker, threatening the stability of institutions they devoted their lives to serving. Her temporary assignment reviewing historical files became a form of professional purgatory, isolating her from current operations while subjecting her to constant observation by colleagues who whispered about her motivations and loyalty. Some viewed her as a whistleblower courageously exposing systemic problems. Others saw her as a traitor undermining military effectiveness during wartime. The psychological pressure was immense, but Sarah drew strength from an unexpected source: letters from family members of soldiers who had died in operations based on the falsified intelligence. Somehow, word of the investigation had reached the military families community, and parents, spouses, and children of fallen service members began reaching out to express their support for her efforts. These letters, many written in shaking handwriting on personal stationery, told stories of loss made more tragic by the knowledge that deaths might have been preventable with accurate information. One letter that particularly moved Sarah came from Martha Walsh, Tommy's mother, who wrote, "Sarah, Tommy told me about you in his last letter home. He said you were the kind of officer who always put your soldiers first, even when it cost you personally. If you're fighting to make sure no other mothers have to bury children because of lies dressed up as intelligence, then you have my complete support. Tommy would want you to keep fighting." The investigation reached a critical juncture when General Morrison presented Williams's findings to Secretary of Defense Patricia Sterling, a former federal judge who had been appointed to bring accountability and transparency to military operations. Sterling's background in civilian law enforcement made her particularly sensitive to issues of evidence tampering and systematic misconduct, and she immediately recognized the implications of the intelligence manipulation scandal. Secretary Sterling ordered a comprehensive review of all intelligence operations, temporarily suspending several ongoing operations pending verification of the intelligence they were based on. The decision sent shockwaves throughout the military command structure, as officers who had built careers on processed intelligence products suddenly found themselves questioning the foundations of their professional expertise. The revelation that intelligence had been systematically altered to support predetermined conclusions forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about military culture and institutional priorities. How had a system designed to provide accurate information to decision-makers become a mechanism for confirming existing biases? Why had career advancement seemed to reward officers who provided convenient answers rather than honest analysis? What did it mean for military effectiveness when truth became subordinate to operational convenience? The personal cost of Sarah's decision became clear when she received notification that she was being considered for court-martial proceedings related to her original insubordination charges in Afghanistan. The timing wasn't coincidental. Even as the intelligence manipulation investigation vindicated her actions, powerful forces within the military hierarchy were working to discredit her by resurrecting old allegations. The message was unmistakable. Challenging institutional authority carried consequences that extended far beyond professional advancement. But something unexpected happened. As news of the investigation began to leak beyond the Pentagon's controlled information environment, military families, veterans organizations, and congressional oversight committees began demanding answers about how intelligence manipulation had contributed to unnecessary casualties and failed operations. What the military leadership had hoped to contain as an internal disciplinary matter was rapidly becoming a public accountability crisis. The breaking point came during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, where Secretary Sterling was scheduled to provide routine updates on military operations overseas. Senator Maria Rodriguez, herself a Navy veteran who had lost a son in Iraq, pressed Sterling for details about the intelligence manipulation allegations that were beginning to appear in news reports. "Madam Secretary," Senator Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the weight of personal loss and professional indignation, "I'm receiving reports that intelligence assessments have been systematically altered to minimize civilian casualty estimates and inflate threat assessments. If true, this represents a fundamental breach of trust with the American people and the service members who rely on accurate information to make life and death decisions." Sterling's response was carefully measured but unequivocal. "Senator, I can confirm that we are conducting a comprehensive investigation into allegations of intelligence manipulation. The initial findings are deeply concerning, and we are taking immediate steps to ensure the integrity of our intelligence processes." The admission sent ripples throughout Washington's political establishment, triggering additional congressional investigations and media scrutiny that transformed Sarah's quiet crusade for truth into a national scandal. Suddenly, the Pentagon found itself under intense public pressure to explain how systematic intelligence manipulation had been allowed to occur and what measures were being implemented to prevent future occurrences. For Sarah, the public attention was both vindication and torment. She had never sought to become a symbol of military reform or governmental accountability. She had simply wanted to ensure that soldiers like Tommy Walsh didn't die because of preventable intelligence failures. But circumstances had thrust her into a spotlight that illuminated not just her individual courage, but the systemic problems that had made her whistleblowing necessary. The most powerful moment of recognition came during a private meeting with General Hawthorne, the same officer who had presided over Sarah's original inquiry hearing. Hawthorne, who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's allegations, had spent weeks reviewing Williams's investigation findings and grappling with their implications for military leadership and institutional integrity. "Major Chen," Hawthorne said, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been present during their first encounter, "I owe you an apology. When you first presented your concerns about intelligence accuracy, I interpreted your actions as insubordination rather than integrity. I was wrong." The general's admission was unprecedented, a senior officer acknowledging that institutional loyalty had blinded her to systemic problems that demanded immediate attention. But her words carried implications beyond personal vindication. They represented a recognition that military culture itself needed to change if it was going to fulfill its fundamental obligation to protect both service members and the civilians they were sworn to defend. The investigation's scope continued to expand as additional whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by Sarah's example and protected by new policies designed to shield those reporting misconduct from retaliation. Captain Elena Vasquez, who had served in Sarah's unit during the Afghanistan operation, provided testimony about how altered intelligence had contributed to operational failures throughout their deployment. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres revealed similar patterns in Iraq, where sanitized intelligence reports had led to civilian casualties that could have been avoided with accurate information. Each new revelation added weight to the growing understanding that intelligence manipulation hadn't been an isolated problem, but a systematic failure that had infected military operations across multiple theaters of conflict. The human cost was staggering: hundreds of unnecessary civilian deaths, dozens of preventable military casualties, failed operations that had achieved nothing beyond the creation of new enemies, and the destruction of trust between military forces and the populations they were meant to protect. The emotional reckoning was equally significant. Officers who had built careers on processed intelligence products found themselves questioning decisions they had made in good faith based on information they now knew had been deliberately falsified. Family members of fallen service members demanded explanations for deaths that might have been preventable with accurate intelligence. Military commanders faced the devastating realization that their pursuit of operational efficiency had contributed to strategic failures and moral compromises that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Colonel Harrison's downfall was swift and complete. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his role in the intelligence manipulation conspiracy, he accepted a plea agreement that resulted in his dismissal from service and the loss of all retirement benefits. His admission of guilt provided prosecutors with additional evidence needed to pursue cases against other officers involved in the systematic falsification of intelligence reports. But the investigation's most significant revelation came when Williams discovered that the intelligence manipulation had extended beyond individual initiative into institutional policy. A classified memorandum, never officially distributed but shared among senior intelligence officers, had established guidelines for optimizing intelligence products to support operational effectiveness. The memorandum's authors had convinced themselves that protecting commanders from moral complexity was a form of patriotic service, not recognizing that their actions were fundamentally corrupting the decision-making process they were meant to support. The document's discovery triggered a complete review of military intelligence protocols, leading to new safeguards designed to preserve the integrity of information provided to decision-makers. But the deeper question remained: how had an institution built on honor, duty, and service allowed expediency to override truth-telling as a fundamental value? For Sarah, the investigation's progress brought a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. She was gratified that Tommy Walsh's death and her own wounds had not been meaningless, that the truth she had fought to expose was finally receiving the attention it deserved. But she also mourned the destruction of careers and relationships that the investigation had caused, recognizing that even necessary accountability carried a human cost that extended far beyond the original wrongdoing. The entry wounds on her back had become more than physical reminders of a specific moment in Afghanistan. They had evolved into symbols of the price that truth-telling demanded in institutions that valued loyalty over honesty. Each scar represented not just a bullet that had torn through her flesh, but a choice that had torn through comfortable assumptions about military culture and institutional integrity. 6 months after Secretary Sterling's congressional testimony, Sarah found herself standing in a very different Pentagon briefing room, this one filled with junior officers attending a newly mandated training session on intelligence integrity and ethical decision-making. The walls bore the same official portraits and formal decorations, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. There was an electricity in the air that spoke to institutional transformation rather than bureaucratic routine. The training program, officially designated as the Ethical Intelligence Initiative, had emerged directly from the investigation Sarah's actions had triggered. Every intelligence officer in the military was now required to complete 40 hours of instruction covering the principles of accurate reporting, the dangers of confirmation bias, and the professional obligations that superseded career advancement considerations. Sarah had been asked to serve as a primary instructor, sharing her experience as both an analyst who had discovered systematic deception and a soldier who had paid a physical price for challenging institutional authority. Standing before a room of young officers whose faces reflected the same idealism she had once carried, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with being viewed as a symbol of institutional reform. These men and women would inherit a military intelligence apparatus that had been fundamentally restructured in response to the failures her investigation had exposed, but the success of that transformation would ultimately depend on their individual commitment to placing truth above convenience. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Intelligence work, Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that came from having paid the price for her convictions, is fundamentally about serving others, the commanders who make decisions based on your analysis, the soldiers who execute operations based on your assessments, and the civilians whose lives are affected by both. When we allow our personal biases, career ambitions, or institutional pressures to corrupt that service, we betray everyone who depends on our integrity. The transformation hadn't been limited to training programs and policy changes. The Pentagon had established a new Office of Intelligence Integrity, staffed by officers whose primary responsibility was monitoring the accuracy of intelligence products and investigating reports of systematic bias or manipulation. The office reported directly to the Secretary of Defense, creating an independent channel for addressing concerns about intelligence corruption before they could metastasize into systematic problems. Captain Rivera, who had been promoted to major following his crucial role in exposing the intelligence manipulation conspiracy, now served as the office's deputy director. His expertise in signals intelligence had proven invaluable in developing new protocols for tracking the digital fingerprints of intelligence products, making it much more difficult for reports to be altered without detection. During quiet moments between meetings, he and Sarah would sometimes reflect on how their coffee break conversations about discrepant reports had evolved into institutional reforms that would affect military operations for decades to come. The personal cost of Sarah's whistleblowing had been substantial, but it had also brought unexpected rewards. Her original court-martial charges had been dropped entirely, replaced with a commendation for exceptional service and moral courage that would become part of her permanent record. More significantly, she had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to lead a new Pentagon division focused on preventing intelligence manipulation and ensuring analytical integrity across all military operations. The work was challenging and sometimes frustrating, requiring Sarah to navigate the complex politics of institutional change while maintaining the principles that had motivated her original decision to speak truth to power. Some officers remained skeptical of the reforms, viewing them as unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles that would hamper military effectiveness. Others embraced the changes with enthusiasm, recognizing that accurate intelligence was essential for both operational success and moral legitimacy. One of Sarah's most significant achievements was the establishment of a formal protection program for military whistleblowers, creating legal safeguards and institutional support for service members who reported misconduct or systematic problems. The program, officially designated as the Integrity Protection Initiative, provided both legal representation and career protection for those who chose to challenge institutional failures at personal cost. The program's first major test came when Sergeant First Class Michael Torres reported systematic equipment failures that were being covered up by his unit's leadership to avoid accountability for maintenance deficiencies. Torres's report, protected under the new whistleblower protocols Sarah had helped develop, led to a comprehensive investigation that prevented potential casualties from equipment failures and resulted in significant improvements to maintenance procedures across multiple military installations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition of Sarah's actions came from an unexpected source: Martha Walsh, Tommy's mother, who had become a vocal advocate for military reform and transparent accountability. Martha had used her son's death as motivation to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting military families affected by intelligence failures and operational misconduct. The Thomas Walsh Foundation for Military Accountability provided both financial support and emotional assistance to families whose loved ones had died in operations compromised by inaccurate intelligence or systematic deception. Martha's tireless advocacy had helped secure congressional passage of legislation requiring regular audits of military intelligence operations and establishing additional protections for military whistleblowers. During the Foundation's first annual memorial service held at Arlington Cemetery near Tommy's grave, Martha spoke about the transformation that had emerged from tragedy and loss. Tommy believed in serving something greater than himself, she said, her voice carrying the strength that comes from turning grief into purpose. Sarah Chen honored that belief by refusing to let his death be meaningless, by fighting to ensure that future soldiers wouldn't die because of preventable intelligence failures. Sarah, who had been invited to speak at the memorial service, found herself struggling with emotions that were both painful and healing. Standing before the white headstones that marked the final positions of so many young men and women who had died in service to their country, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with being chosen to survive, to bear witness, to transform individual sacrifice into institutional change. Tommy Walsh was a soldier who believed in doing the right thing even when it was difficult or dangerous, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the rolling hills where America's war dead lay in eternal formation. His death taught me that some truths are too important to remain buried, that the temporary pain of accountability is preferable to the permanent damage of systematic deception. The institutional changes continued to ripple outward as the military grappled with the implications of the intelligence manipulation scandal. New training programs emphasized the importance of intellectual honesty and moral courage in intelligence analysis. Promotion criteria were revised to reward accuracy and integrity rather than the production of intelligence products that supported predetermined operational objectives. Career advancement opportunities were created specifically for officers who demonstrated exceptional commitment to truth-telling and institutional transparency. The transformation wasn't limited to the intelligence community. The scandal had forced a broader examination of military culture and institutional priorities, leading to reforms in training, leadership development, and ethical education that extended throughout all branches of service. Military academies revised their curricula to include extensive instruction on moral decision-making and the obligations that accompany positions of trust and authority. Sarah's role in the transformation had evolved from that of an individual whistleblower to an institutional reformer whose expertise was sought by congressional committees, academic institutions, and reform organizations throughout the government. She testified before Senate committees about the importance of protecting military whistleblowers, consulted with other agencies about developing integrity protection programs, and spoke at conferences about the relationship between transparency and institutional effectiveness. But despite the recognition and professional success that had followed her decision to expose the intelligence manipulation conspiracy, Sarah remained haunted by the knowledge that reform, however comprehensive, could not undo the damage that had already been done. Tommy Walsh and dozens of other service members were still dead, killed in operations based on falsified intelligence. Hundreds of civilians had died in strikes that might have been avoided with accurate information. No amount of institutional change could resurrect the lives that had been lost or heal the families that had been destroyed by systematic deception. The entry wounds on her back had faded into pale scars that were barely visible unless examined closely, but they remained sensitive to changes in weather and atmospheric pressure, a permanent barometer calibrated to detect incoming storms. On some mornings, when she performed the physical therapy exercises that maintained mobility in muscles and joints reorganized by surgery and time, Sarah would feel the pull of scar tissue and remember not just the bullets that had torn through her flesh, but the choice that had torn through comfortable assumptions about loyalty and institutional integrity. 3 years later, the auditorium at the Air Force Academy was filled with graduating cadets, whose faces reflected the same mixture of idealism and determination that Sarah remembered from her own commissioning ceremony 2 decades earlier. But these young officers were inheriting a military transformed by the institutional reforms that had emerged from the intelligence manipulation scandal, a transformation that had touched every aspect of military culture and operational procedure. Sarah, now serving as the Academy's Director of Ethics and Integrity, watched from the podium as hundreds of soon-to-be second lieutenants prepared to receive their commissions and begin careers that would unfold in an environment fundamentally different from the one she had entered. The mandatory ethics training they had completed included extensive instruction on moral courage, institutional transparency, and the professional obligations that superseded personal advancement, lessons learned from the systematic failures her investigation had exposed. Cadet Jennifer Martinez, the class valedictorian, had chosen to focus her graduation speech on the importance of truth-telling in military service, directly referencing the intelligence integrity reforms that had reshaped military culture. The officers who came before us faced difficult choices about loyalty and honesty, about following orders and doing what was right, Martinez said, her voice carrying across the auditorium with remarkable confidence. Their courage in choosing truth over convenience has given us a military that is both more effective and more ethical. The speech resonated with Sarah in ways that were both gratifying and bittersweet. These graduating cadets would never face the choice between accurate intelligence and career advancement, because institutional safeguards now prevented intelligence manipulation before it could occur. They would serve in a military where reporting misconduct was protected rather than punished, where moral courage was rewarded rather than feared, where speaking truth to power was recognized as a fundamental professional obligation. But the transformation had come at a cost that extended far beyond Sarah's individual sacrifice. Colonel Harrison had died by suicide 18 months earlier, unable to cope with the disgrace that had followed his conviction for intelligence manipulation. 3 other officers involved in the conspiracy had suffered nervous breakdowns requiring extended medical treatment. Families had been destroyed, careers had been ended, reputations had been permanently damaged by the accountability process that institutional reform had demanded. 5 years later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon Memorial Chapel, officiating at the dedication ceremony for a new memorial honoring military whistleblowers who had sacrificed their careers to expose institutional failures and protect the integrity of military service. The memorial, carved from black granite quarried from the same Vermont mountains that had provided stone for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, bore the names of dozens of service members who had chosen truth over personal security across decades of military history. Thomas Walsh's name was carved near the top of the memorial, not because he had been a whistleblower, but because his death had inspired the investigation that had transformed military intelligence practices. Below his name were inscribed the words that had become the unofficial motto of the military's integrity protection programs. Some truths are too important to remain buried. Martha Walsh, now in her 70s but still possessing the fierce determination that had driven her advocacy for military reform, placed a wreath at the memorial's base while family members of other fallen service members watched in respectful silence. The ceremony had drawn attendees from across the military hierarchy, including Secretary Sterling, who had announced her intention to establish similar memorials at military installations throughout the world. "These names represent more than individual courage," Sterling said during her dedication remarks. "They represent a commitment to institutional integrity that transcends personal interest, a willingness to sacrifice comfort and security for the principles that make military service meaningful." Captain Alina Reyes, now a full colonel serving as the Pentagon's Director of Intelligence Integrity, had traveled from her assignment in Germany to attend the ceremony. Her own testimony during the intelligence manipulation investigation had contributed to reforms that had prevented similar failures in European operations, where accurate intelligence had become essential for complex peacekeeping missions in regions torn by ethnic conflict and political instability. During the reception following the dedication ceremony, Vasquez and Sarah found themselves standing together before Tommy Walsh's name on the memorial, both lost in memories of a young sergeant who had died believing he was serving his country honorably, never knowing that the intelligence guiding his final mission had been systematically falsified. "Do you think he would be proud of what we've accomplished?" Vasquez asked, her voice carrying the weariness that came from 2 decades of military service in an era of constant conflict and institutional transformation. Sarah considered the question while watching sunlight filter through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the memorial's black stone surface. "I think he would be proud that his death wasn't meaningless, that it contributed to changes that might prevent other young soldiers from dying because of preventable intelligence failures. But I also think he would be sad that change required so much destruction and pain." 7 years later, the book tour had taken Sarah to universities and military installations across the country, where she spoke about the relationship between individual moral courage and institutional integrity. Her memoir, Entry Wounds: A Soldier's Journey from Silence to Truth, had become required reading at military academies and leadership training programs, providing both a personal narrative of moral decision-making and a case study in the institutional reforms that had emerged from systematic failure. The book's title referred not just to the physical scars that remained from her injuries in Afghanistan, but to the way truth could wound institutions that had grown comfortable with convenient deceptions. The entry wounds she had received from enemy bullets had healed into small, neat scars, but the institutional wounds created by her investigation had required years of painful treatment and careful rehabilitation. During a speaking engagement at Georgetown University's Public Policy School, a graduate student asked Sarah whether she regretted the decision to expose the intelligence manipulation conspiracy, given the careers that had been destroyed and the institutional turmoil that had followed. The question had become familiar over the years, but Sarah's answer had evolved as she'd gained perspective on the long-term consequences of her actions. "Regret is the wrong word," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the authority that came from having lived with the consequences of her choices for nearly a decade. "I regret that institutional failures made my investigation necessary. I regret that young soldiers died because of preventable intelligence failures. I regret that systematic deception was allowed to flourish in an institution built on honor and integrity. But I don't regret choosing truth over comfort, accountability over complicity." The audience, comprised primarily of future policymakers and government officials, listened with the intense attention that came from recognizing they would face similar choices in their own careers. Sarah's story had become more than a military case study. It had evolved into a broader lesson about the importance of individual moral courage in maintaining institutional integrity across all forms of public service. 10 years later, General Sarah Chen stood in her Pentagon office, preparing for her final day of active duty after 3 decades of military service. The walls were decorated with photographs that told the story of a career that had evolved from conventional intelligence analysis to institutional reform and ethical leadership. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star from her service in Afghanistan were displayed alongside the Presidential Medal of Freedom she had received for her role in transforming military intelligence practices. The office's most prominent decoration was a framed photograph of the Air Force Academy's class of 2035, the first graduating class to complete their entire education under the reformed curriculum that emphasized ethical decision-making and institutional transparency. These young officers, now serving in leadership positions throughout the military, represented the full realization of the institutional transformation that had emerged from her investigation 15 years earlier. Captain Rivera, now General Rivera, and serving as the Pentagon's Director of Intelligence Operations, knocked on her door and entered carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Their friendship had survived the investigation that had destroyed so many other relationships, strengthened by shared commitment to principles that had proven more durable than personal ambition or institutional loyalty. "Congratulations on 30 years of service," Rivera said, pouring champagne into glasses that reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through her office windows. "And thank you for having the courage to choose truth over convenience when it mattered most." They raised their glasses in a toast that encompassed not just Sarah's individual career, but the institutional transformation that had emerged from her moral courage. The Pentagon bustling outside her office windows was fundamentally different from the building she had entered as a young officer, changed by reforms that had prioritized integrity over expediency and transparency over institutional comfort. The entry wounds on Sarah's back had long since faded into barely visible scars, but they remained sensitive to atmospheric changes, a permanent barometer that reminded her daily of the morning in Afghanistan when she had learned that some prices were worth paying. The bullets that had torn through her flesh had also torn through comfortable assumptions about military culture and institutional priorities, creating space for the truth-telling and accountability that had ultimately made the military more effective and more ethical. 15 years later, the memorial service was held at Arlington Cemetery, where autumn leaves drifted down on the white headstones like nature's own tribute to the fallen. Martha Walsh had lived to see her 90th birthday, and the full implementation of the military reforms her advocacy had helped establish, passing away peacefully in her sleep with the knowledge that her son's death had contributed to institutional changes that would protect future generations of service members. Sarah, now retired from active duty but still serving as a consultant on military ethics and institutional integrity, delivered the eulogy for the woman who had transformed personal grief into systemic reform. Martha's tireless advocacy had contributed to congressional legislation, Pentagon policy changes, and cultural transformation that had rippled throughout American society, demonstrating how individual moral courage could catalyze institutional change that extended far beyond its original scope. Martha Walsh understood that love for her son required more than private grief, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the cemetery where so many stories of sacrifice and service lay buried beneath manicured grass and carefully maintained monuments. She transformed her loss into a demand for accountability that has protected countless other families from experiencing preventable tragedy. The funeral was attended by dozens of military families who had been helped by the foundation Martha had established, along with current and former military officers whose careers had been shaped by the reforms her advocacy had inspired. Secretary Sterling, now in her 80s but still sharp and determined, spoke about Martha's role in transforming military culture, from one that prioritized institutional loyalty over individual conscience to one that recognized moral courage as the foundation of effective leadership. The graveside service concluded with the traditional military ceremony honoring those who had served their country through civilian advocacy and moral leadership. As the flag was folded and presented to Martha's surviving family members, Sarah reflected on the way individual actions could echo across decades, transforming institutions and protecting lives in ways that were often invisible to those who made the original sacrifice. 20 years later, the documentary crew followed Sarah through the Pentagon's corridors, capturing her reflections on the intelligence manipulation scandal that had defined her military career and reshaped American military culture. Entry Wounds: 2 Decades of Reform would premiere on the 20th anniversary of her original investigation, providing both historical perspective and contemporary analysis of the institutional changes that had emerged from systematic failure. The Pentagon she walked through bore little resemblance to the building where she had first discovered evidence of intelligence manipulation 2 decades earlier. New offices housed the expanded Intelligence Integrity Division, where teams of analysts worked to prevent the systematic deceptions that had once been common practice. Training centers throughout the building provided constant instruction on ethical decision-making and moral courage, ensuring that future officers would understand their professional obligations to truth-telling and accountability. The documentary's most powerful segment featured interviews with young officers whose careers had unfolded entirely within the reformed military culture that Sarah's investigation had created. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Martinez, the former cadet valedictorian who now commanded an intelligence unit in the Pacific, spoke about serving in a military where integrity was rewarded rather than punished, where speaking truth to power was recognized as a fundamental professional obligation. The officers who came before us paid a price for institutional reform that we sometimes take for granted, Martinez said, her uniform bearing ribbons that reflected service in a military transformed by ethical leadership and transparent accountability. We have an obligation to honor their sacrifice by maintaining the standards they fought to establish. The documentary's final sequence showed Sarah standing before the Pentagon memorial honoring military whistleblowers, her reflection visible in the polished granite that bore the names of service members who had chosen institutional integrity over personal security. The entry wounds from her service in Afghanistan were no longer visible, but their legacy lived on in the reforms that had emerged from her moral courage and the lives that had been saved by institutional transparency. As the film crew concluded their work, Sarah looked out across the Arlington landscape where so many stories of service and sacrifice lay buried beneath carefully tended grass. The morning sun painted the white headstones gold and crimson, the same color she remembered from her last dawn in Afghanistan, when she had learned that some truths were too important to remain silent, and some prices were worth paying regardless of personal cost. The general who had once stood at attention before an inquiry panel now stood as a symbol of institutional transformation, her individual choice to speak truth to power, having echoed across 2 decades of military reform. The entry wounds that had marked her body with the price of moral courage had faded into invisible scars, but their impact continued to ripple through an institution that had learned to value integrity over convenience, transparency over comfort, and truth over institutional loyalty. The morning breeze stirred the American flag hanging outside the Pentagon, its colors as bright and true as the principles that had guided Sarah's journey from silence to truth, from individual conscience to institutional reform, from the entry wounds that had marked her flesh to the legacy that would protect future generations of those who chose to serve. In the distance, the sounds of military life continued, helicopters carrying supplies to unknown destinations, officers hurrying between meetings that would shape policy and strategy, young service members beginning careers in a military transformed by the courage of those who had chosen truth over comfort. The institution they served had been wounded by systematic deception, but had healed stronger, more ethical, more effective, because someone had been willing to pay the price for integrity and accountability. The entry wounds had become exit points for institutional failure and moral compromise, creating space for the transparency and ethical leadership that would define American military service for generations to come. The scars remained invisible now, but their legacy lived on in every young officer who learned that some truths were too important to remain buried, some principles too valuable to be compromised, and some prices worth paying for the privilege of serving with honor, integrity, and moral courage. Subscribe to Stories of Courage, where silence is never forgotten. 25 years later, the congressional hearing room was packed with journalists, military families, and government officials who had gathered to witness what many considered the final chapter in the intelligence manipulation scandal that had reshaped American military culture a generation earlier. General Sarah Chen, now 72 and serving as the chair of the National Military Ethics Commission, sat at the witness table with the same straight-backed posture she had maintained throughout her career, though silver had long since replaced the black hair that had once been pulled into regulation buns. The hearing had been called to examine the long-term effectiveness of the military reforms that had emerged from Sarah's original investigation, but it had evolved into something more significant, a national reckoning with the relationship between individual moral courage and institutional integrity. Senator Patricia Williams, the daughter of Colonel Janet Williams who had led the original investigation, now served as the committee's chairwoman, her own career shaped by the example of those who had chosen truth over convenience decades earlier. General Chen, Senator Williams began, her voice carrying the same measured authority that had characterized her mother's approach to complex investigations. It has been 25 years since your decision to expose systematic intelligence manipulation transformed military culture. From your current perspective, how do you assess the durability of those reforms? Sarah's answer came without hesitation, shaped by decades of watching young officers navigate moral challenges in an institution that had learned to value integrity over expediency. Senator, the reforms have held because they addressed fundamental questions about the purpose of military service. We learned that protecting soldiers and civilians requires more than tactical effectiveness. It demands moral courage at every level of command. The hearing room stirred as Sarah continued, her words carrying the weight of someone who had lived through both the failures that necessitated reform and the institutional transformation that followed. The officers serving today inherited a military culture that recognizes truth-telling as a professional obligation rather than a career risk. That cultural change has proven more durable than any policy or regulation because it addresses the character of service rather than just its procedures. Representative Michael Torres, the son of Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, who had been one of the early whistleblowers following Sarah's investigation, pressed for more specific details about the reform's measurable impact. General, can you quantify the lives saved by the intelligence integrity protocols that emerged from your investigation? The question touched on numbers that Sarah had carried in her memory for decades. Casualty reports that tracked the decline in friendly fire incidents, civilian deaths prevented by accurate intelligence, military operations that had succeeded because commanders received honest assessments rather than sanitized summaries. The statistics were compelling, but they couldn't capture the human stories behind each prevented tragedy. Congressman, the Intelligence Integrity Division estimates that accurate intelligence protocols have prevented approximately 3,000 civilian casualties and 800 military deaths over the past 25 years, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of those numbers. But beyond statistics, we've created a military culture where young officers understand that their professional obligation extends beyond following orders to ensuring those orders are based on truthful information. The hearing's most emotional moment came when Martha Walsh's granddaughter, Lieutenant Colonel Amy Walsh, took her place at the witness table. Amy had followed her Uncle Tommy into military service, but unlike him, she had served her entire career in a military transformed by the investigation his death had inspired. Her uniform bore ribbons reflecting service in peacekeeping missions where accurate intelligence had prevented conflicts rather than escalating them. General Chen, Amy said, her voice carrying both personal gratitude and professional respect, my family has lived with the consequences of both intelligence failure and institutional reform. My uncle died because commanders made decisions based on falsified information, but countless other families have been spared that loss because you had the courage to expose systematic deception. How do we ensure that future generations of military leaders maintain that commitment to truth? Sarah's response drew on lessons learned through decades of teaching ethics at military academies and training centers, where she had worked to institutionalize the moral courage that had once been left to individual conscience. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, the key is understanding that integrity is not just a personal virtue but an operational requirement. When we teach young officers that accurate intelligence is essential for mission success, we make truth-telling a matter of professional competence rather than moral heroism. The hearing concluded with testimony from international observers who described how American military reforms had influenced allied nations' approach to intelligence integrity and institutional accountability. General François Dubois of the French Army spoke about NATO protocols that now required multiple verification sources for intelligence assessments, while Colonel Yuki Tanaka of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces described training programs modeled on American ethics education that emphasized moral courage alongside tactical competence. As the formal proceedings ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by young military officers who had attended the hearing as part of their professional development training. Their faces reflected the same idealism she remembered from her own early career, but they served in an institution that had learned to channel that idealism toward both tactical effectiveness and ethical leadership. Captain Jessica Martinez, an intelligence officer assigned to the Pentagon's Middle East Division, approached Sarah with questions about maintaining integrity in complex operational environments, where the line between military necessity and moral compromise remained challenging to navigate. General, how do we balance the need for decisive action with the requirement for comprehensive intelligence verification? The question reflected the sophisticated moral reasoning that had become characteristic of officers trained in the reformed military culture, where ethical decision-making was treated as a technical skill requiring constant practice and refinement. Sarah's answer drew on decades of experience teaching young officers to navigate the complex intersection of moral principle and operational reality. Captain, the balance comes from understanding that accuracy and speed are not opposing requirements, Sarah explained, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had answered similar questions thousands of times over the years. Systematic verification processes actually enable faster decision-making by providing commanders with reliable information they can act on with confidence. The delays come from having to correct mistakes caused by inaccurate initial assessments. 30 years later, The dedication ceremony for the new National Military Ethics Center took place on a crisp autumn morning at the site of the former Pentagon Memorial Chapel, which had been expanded into a comprehensive facility designed to train military leaders in ethical decision-making and institutional accountability. Sarah, now 77 and walking with a cane that reflected decades of wear on joints reorganized by surgery and time, served as the keynote speaker for an event that represented the culmination of institutional transformation that had begun with her investigation 3 decades earlier. The center's design incorporated elements that told the story of military reform through architectural symbolism: walls of Vermont granite similar to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, windows arranged to provide natural light that eliminated the harsh fluorescent illumination of traditional military briefing rooms, and open spaces that encouraged collaborative discussion rather than hierarchical presentation. The building's central feature was a reflection pool, surrounded by the names of all military personnel who had died in operations based on falsified intelligence, with Thomas Walsh's name prominently displayed among those honored. President Maria Rodriguez, herself a Navy veteran who had been influenced by the military reforms during her own service, spoke about the center's role in preparing future military leaders for the complex ethical challenges they would face in an increasingly interconnected world. "This facility represents more than just training infrastructure," the president said, her voice carrying across an audience that included military leaders from dozens of allied nations. "It embodies our national commitment to the principle that military effectiveness requires moral courage, that tactical success demands ethical leadership." The ceremony's most powerful moment came when Sarah was presented with the newly created Presidential Medal for Institutional Courage, an award designed to recognize individuals whose actions had fundamentally improved American democratic institutions. The medal's design incorporated imagery from both her Purple Heart and the memorial honoring military whistleblowers, symbolizing the connection between personal sacrifice and institutional transformation. General Chen's courage in exposing systematic intelligence manipulation represents the finest tradition of American military service, President Rodriguez said during the presentation ceremony. Her actions demonstrated that true loyalty to country requires the willingness to challenge institutional failures, even at great personal cost. "The military culture we celebrate today exists because one officer chose truth over comfort, accountability over complicity." Sarah's acceptance speech drew on reflections developed through decades of teaching and writing about the relationship between individual moral courage and institutional integrity. Her words were directed particularly toward the young officers in attendance, many of whom would inherit leadership positions in a military that had been fundamentally shaped by the reforms her investigation had initiated. 30 years ago, I made a choice that seemed simple at the time: to report intelligence manipulation that was contributing to preventable casualties," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority that came from having lived with the consequences of that decision for 3 decades. "What I learned was that individual moral courage can catalyze institutional transformation that extends far beyond the original act of conscience. The military you serve today exists because many people chose to support difficult truths rather than comfortable lies." The speech continued with specific guidance for officers who might face similar moral challenges in their own careers, drawing on case studies and lessons learned from decades of institutional reform. Sarah emphasized that ethical leadership required not just individual virtue, but systematic approaches to moral decision-making that could be taught, practiced, and institutionalized across large organizations. "The entry wounds I received in Afghanistan healed into scars that reminded me daily of the price of moral courage," Sarah concluded, her hand unconsciously moving toward her back where bullets had once torn through flesh and bone. "But the institutional wounds created by systematic deception required years of careful treatment and rehabilitation. Your generation inherited a military that learned to value integrity over convenience, transparency over comfort. Your obligation is to maintain those standards while adapting them to new challenges and changing circumstances." The private reception following the dedication ceremony brought together many of the individuals whose lives had been shaped by the intelligence manipulation scandal and its aftermath. General Rivera, now retired and serving as a military historian, spoke with Sarah about the manuscript he was completing on the institutional transformation that had emerged from her investigation. The book, tentatively titled "From Deception to Integrity: A Military Transformation," would provide the definitive historical account of how individual moral courage had catalyzed systematic organizational change. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had transitioned from military service to academic research on organizational ethics, presented Sarah with the preliminary findings from her longitudinal study of military culture change. The research, conducted over 2 decades, demonstrated measurable improvements in decision-making quality, operational effectiveness, and ethical leadership that could be directly attributed to the reforms implemented following the intelligence manipulation investigation. "The data confirms what we've observed anecdotally," Dr. Vasquez explained, her voice carrying the excitement of someone whose academic work had validated decades of institutional reform efforts. "Military units operating under the integrity protocols show significantly better mission success rates, lower casualty rates, and higher morale scores than comparable historical units. Ethical leadership isn't just morally superior, it's tactically more effective." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ambassador Jennifer Martinez, who had transitioned from military service to diplomatic work, where she had applied lessons learned from military reform to improve transparency and accountability in international negotiations. Her experience demonstrated how the principles of institutional integrity could be adapted beyond military contexts to improve democratic governance more broadly. "Sarah's investigation taught us that institutional loyalty without moral courage is actually institutional betrayal," Ambassador Martinez observed, her words reflecting decades of experience applying ethical leadership principles in complex international environments. "Whether we're serving in military units or diplomatic missions, our obligation is to the principles that make service meaningful, not just to the organizations that employ us." The reception's most emotional moment came when Captain David Chen, Sarah's nephew, who had chosen to follow his aunt into military service, presented her with a letter from his unit deployed in the Pacific. The letter, signed by 37 young officers, expressed gratitude for the institutional culture they had inherited and committed them to maintaining the standards of integrity and transparency that had been purchased at such personal cost by previous generations of military leaders. "He, Osa," Aunt Sarah, Captain Chen said, his voice carrying both family pride and professional respect. "These officers wanted you to know that they understand they're serving in a military transformed by your courage. They've committed themselves to maintaining the standards you established and adapting them to meet new challenges we can't yet anticipate." As the reception concluded and guests began departing for their various destinations, Sarah found herself alone in the center's reflection room, where afternoon sunlight filtered through windows designed to eliminate the harsh shadows that had characterized traditional military briefing spaces. The room's central feature was a meditation garden where visitors could contemplate the relationship between individual conscience and institutional responsibility. Sitting quietly among the carefully tended plants and flowing water, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a hospital bed in Afghanistan to this moment of recognition and institutional transformation. The entry wounds that had marked her body with the price of moral courage had long since faded into invisible scars, but their legacy lived on in the thousands of young officers who would never face the choice between accurate intelligence and career advancement, because systematic safeguards now prevented intelligence manipulation before it could occur. The physical therapy exercises that had once been necessary to maintain mobility in muscles and joints reorganized by surgery had evolved into a daily meditation on the relationship between personal sacrifice and public service. Each morning stretch reminded her that some prices were worth paying, some truths too important to remain buried, some principles too valuable to be compromised for temporary advantage or institutional convenience. The room's silence was interrupted by the arrival of General Patricia Hawthorne's daughter, Colonel Lisa Hawthorne, who now served as the Director of Military Ethics Education at the Defense Department. Colonel Hawthorne had requested a private meeting to discuss her mother's legacy and the role that Sarah's investigation had played in transforming her family's understanding of military leadership and institutional responsibility. "General Chen," Colonel Hawthorne began, her voice carrying the measured tone that had characterized her mother's approach to complex leadership challenges, "My mother spent her final years writing about the intelligence manipulation investigation and its impact on military culture. She wanted me to share her conclusion that your courage in exposing systematic deception saved not just individual lives but the institutional integrity of American military service." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics that ranged from specific policy implementations to broader questions about the role of moral courage in democratic institutions. Colonel Hawthorne's insights reflected both personal perspective as the daughter of someone who had been transformed by the investigation and professional expertise, as someone responsible for training future military leaders in ethical decision-making. The officers we're graduating today understand that integrity is not just a personal virtue but an operational requirement, Colonel Hawthorne observed, her words echoing themes that had emerged throughout the day's ceremonies and conversations. They've learned that accurate intelligence, transparent communication, and ethical leadership are not obstacles to military effectiveness but essential components of successful operations. As evening approached and the last visitors departed from the new Ethics Center, Sarah made her way to the building's memorial wall, where the names of all military personnel who had died in operations based on falsified intelligence were carved in black granite, similar to that used for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Thomas Walsh's name occupied a prominent position among those honored, his sacrifice having catalyzed the institutional transformation that now protected countless others. Standing before Tommy's name, Sarah spoke quietly to the memory of the young sergeant whose death had given meaning to her investigation, and whose mother's advocacy had ensured that individual sacrifice became institutional change. Tommy, you believed in serving something greater than yourself. Your death taught me that some truths are too important to remain buried, that the temporary pain of accountability is preferable to the permanent damage of systematic deception. I hope we've honored your service by creating a military worthy of your sacrifice. The memorial wall's polished surface reflected Sarah's image back to her, showing a woman who had aged with the dignity that comes from living according to principles that transcend personal advancement or institutional convenience. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with decades of difficult decisions and their consequences, but her eyes retained the clarity that had enabled her to see through comfortable deceptions to uncomfortable truths. The building's security lights activated as darkness settled over the complex, illuminating pathways designed to encourage reflection and contemplation among visitors seeking to understand the relationship between individual moral courage and institutional integrity. The facility would serve future generations of military leaders as both training center and monument to the principle that democratic institutions require continuous moral vigilance from those privileged to serve within them. Walking slowly toward her car in the visitor parking area, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a young officer dreaming of serving her country to a senior leader whose investigation had fundamentally transformed military culture. The path had been marked by physical wounds that had healed into invisible scars, professional challenges that had tested every aspect of her character, and personal sacrifices that had seemed impossible to bear at the time they were demanded. But the alternative, remaining silent while systematic deception contributed to preventable casualties and institutional corruption, had never been acceptable to someone who understood that military service was fundamentally about protecting others from harm. The entry wounds that had marked her body with the price of moral courage had become exit points for institutional failure and ethical compromise, creating space for the transparency and accountability that now characterized American military operations. The drive home through Washington's evening traffic provided time for final reflections on the day's ceremonies and the 30-year journey they represented. The city's monuments and memorials, illuminated against the night sky, told stories of sacrifice and service that spanned centuries of American military history. Sarah's investigation had added another chapter to that history, demonstrating how individual moral courage could catalyze institutional transformation that honored both the fallen and the living. Arriving at her apartment in Arlington, Sarah was greeted by walls decorated with photographs that told the story of a career devoted to institutional integrity and ethical leadership. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star from her service in Afghanistan were displayed alongside the Presidential Medal for Institutional Courage she had received that afternoon, representing different aspects of service that had defined her life's work. The evening's final ritual was a call to her nephew David, deployed with his unit in the Pacific, where he was applying lessons learned from decades of military reform to new challenges in an increasingly complex global environment. Their conversation, conducted through encrypted video communications that protected operational security while enabling family connection, reminded Sarah that the institutional transformation she had initiated would continue through future generations of officers committed to ethical leadership and moral courage. "Aunt Sarah," Captain Chen said as their conversation concluded, "thank you for showing us that integrity is not just a personal virtue but a professional obligation. The military we serve today exists because you chose truth over comfort, accountability over complicity. We won't let you down." As the call ended and Sarah prepared for sleep, she felt the familiar ache in her back, where old wounds pulled against scar tissue that had never quite learned to bend the way it should. But the pain served as a compass pointing toward moral north, toward the understanding that some prices were worth paying, some truths too important to remain buried, some principles too valuable to be compromised for temporary advantage or institutional convenience. The entry wounds that had marked her flesh with the cost of moral courage had faded into invisible reminders of a choice that had transformed not just her own life but the institution she had devoted herself to serving. The military culture that young officers now inherited had been purchased with individual sacrifice, but sustained by collective commitment to principles that transcended personal interest or organizational loyalty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply lessons learned through decades of institutional transformation, new occasions to demonstrate that ethical leadership was not just morally superior but tactically more effective than the comfortable deceptions that had once characterized military culture. The entry wounds had become exit points for institutional failure, creating space for the integrity and transparency that would protect future generations of those who chose to serve with honor, courage, and moral conviction. The story that had begun with bullets tearing through flesh in an Afghan village had evolved into institutional transformation that would echo through generations of military service, a legacy measured not in medals or promotions, but in lives saved and principles preserved. The general who had once stood at attention before an inquiry panel now rested knowing that her individual choice to speak truth to power had created a military worthy of the sacrifice it demanded from those who served. In the darkness of her Arlington apartment, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a city that never quite stopped moving, Sarah Chen closed her eyes and felt the peace that comes from knowing that some battles are worth fighting, some wounds worth bearing, some truths worth defending regardless of personal cost. The entry wounds had healed, but their legacy would endure as long as military service remained a sacred trust, requiring moral courage, institutional integrity, and the willingness to choose truth over comfort in the service of something greater than oneself. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.